Hi everybody, welcome to Critical Practices 3A Week 3. This is just going to be a short 10-minute lecture that takes us from where we were last week when we were looking at museums and institutions to where we're going, which is discussions more of the contemporary. What constitutes the contemporary? The contemporary as a historical condition, both in terms of its periodization, but also as thinking contemporary. So we're just going to very quickly just give you a quick overview of Claire Bishop's Radical Museology, the entire book of which is available on the Milo. It's quite an easy read, I think. It does have some complicated moments when she looks at theorists such as Agamben and others, but actually I think that there's a lot of pertinent discussions in there that will help us move from one space to the next. Claire Bishop explores the strategies employed by three museums. The Van Abbers Museum in Eindhoven, a museum that emerged in the 1930s, the height of modernism. The Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, which emerged in the 1990s. And a 21st century museum, the Metelkova Museum of Contemporary Art, or just sometimes known as MUSM, in Ljubljana. So, Claire Bishop starts by looking at the particular rage and particular race almost to the top in terms of building new contemporary art museums, and in particular what is binding them. Claire Bishop attests that the contemporary equates to a kind of cool, that contemporaneity is not so much concerned with living in the present, nor is it a concern with collections or particularly delivering an ideological position, but it is rather looking at consumption. The contemporary equals cool, cool equals consumption, it is the Instagrammable, it is the tweetable, it is the social mediatized, well-designed, and it is of course also economically successful. So for Bishop, this race to define a contemporary, and in particular the emergence of whole new sets of contemporary museums, suggests that the contemporary is what in her terms is an operative fiction. It's in many respects a contradiction between fragmented, incompatible, global temporalities and the present, the now. So the contemporary in Claire Bishop's view is not the simple harmonization of the sense of the present, but rather that the contemporary is an attempt to make sense of mutually incompatible and contradictory positions. So the contemporary has, in Bishop's terms, very little to do with the present. It has actually instead to do with a jumble of incompatible ideas. The museum, as we considered last week, more often than not has sought to present a single coherent voice. And this is as true of the Contemporary Museum as it is of the Survey Museum identified by Duncan and Wallach last week. So the contemporary may make historical or trans-historical connections, but it seeks to harmonise that and to present it as a sort of a unified voice, a coherent voice. Claire Bishop continues as she goes on through her introduction. My argument is, she says, that museums with the historical collections have become the most fruitful testing ground for a non-presentism, multi-temporal contemporaneity. That actually the idea of the contemporary museum may in some respects be anti-contemporary, that actually we can explore the contemporary through historical lenses. Bishop suggests that the main problem with many survey museums, and we could count TMAG, NGV, NGA, etc., is that they maintain custodianship of history, a custodianship of a particular collection. And this position presents itself from presenting, it really inhibits its capacity to present a contemporary, because the main function of that museum is to be custodian of a particular historical collection. But she would say it's not that the contemporary is by its very nature ahistorical or anti-historical, but it is, as Bishop continues to argue, museums have often mistaken history as a set of objects. History is, as we saw with Brooke Andrew last week, also about the instruments of history. Okay, and it's the museum's confusion with history, with things, that Claire Bishop takes issue with. So if we look, for instance, at some of these new museums, in particular the new contemporary, if we look at Tate Modern, it is organised both chronologically and thematically. They have their four central trans-historical, trans-global themes, but at the same time they attest to the capacity to organise through chronological things. And viewers are presented with both. So as we walk along the main atrium on the first floor of the Tate Modern, we are presented with, just as we have with Alfred H. Barr before us, a whole set of chronologies with major names, major artists, etc. Right? So this canonical thinking may in fact have been liberated by the presence of non-white artists, of non-European artists, of women. It nevertheless still follows the logic of modernism. This happens, and it leads us to the present. Bishop considers 3 museums that she thinks are attesting to the contemporary in a very different way from that of the present. Here is the Van Abbers Museum in Eindhoven, established in 1936. Bishop considers a whole different range of strategies for rethinking the contemporary. This museum is continually moving, continually being restructured, and continually being, in their terms, replayed. There's nothing stable about its curatorial position. There's nothing stable around its relationship to its collection. It uses a range of curatorial strategies that doesn't seek to make sense of the collection and its relationship to the present. Instead, it contests that collections don't make museums, connections do. So the museum, in this sense, is a relationship manager, trying to find new ways of connecting works regardless of their place in the museum. And of course, it's not without controversy, because many of the major acquisitions of the Van Abbers Museum, work by Jeff Koons, for instance, have often been relegated to the storeroom for months, perhaps even years. So that rather than the museum as being the custodian of fine works, the Van Abbers Museum contests that its role in the world is to forge connections, continually changing connections that are responsive to our connections with place, politics, and culture. This, of course, is the complete antithesis of the Louvre and the Survey Museum, which is precisely ordered around great works, and then all of the other works are placed in relationship to those great works, in this case national works. So we have the canonical works, and then we present the French or the German in relationship to those. The second museum and the second set of strategies Bishop considers is that of the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Okay. Founded in 1992, it occupies 2 enormous buildings in the centre. Now, at first glance, of course, Reina Sofia seems quite conventional, seems to be quite focused on the usual business of organising collections around national, stylistic or thematic goals and canons. Yet actually there's something quite interesting going on that might be pertinent for our discussions in class. The presentation of the permanent collection has undergone important changes as the museum has adopted a self-critical representation of the country's colonial past, positioning Spain's own history within a large international context. And this is important. It is a self-critical representation. The Reina Sofia contest that not only is their role to represent the colonial history, they have to represent their role and be critical of their role in that representation. That the museum is not some ideological neutral space of objective history in which those histories have now been corrected or addressed and those traumatic genocidal pasts are now suddenly at the surface. It also contests that the museum itself has played a role in that colonial ideal, in that genocidal thrust of that hierarchical condition. So it's not just critical of colonialism, it's critical of the museum's role within colonial systems. Quote from Bishop here: "The starting point for the museum is therefore multiple modernities. An art history no longer conceived in terms of avant-garde originals and peripheral derivatives, since this always prioritised the European centre and ignores the extent to which the apparently belated works hold other values in their own context. The apparatus, in turn, is reconceived as an archive of the commons, a collection available to everyone because culture is not a question of national property, but a universal resource. Redefining the Reina Sofia, as indeed many contemporary arts have done, away from the ideas of the nation and the idea of the national picture, is one that is not without considerable controversy, particularly with regards to funding mechanisms, with politicians who like to spend money on national collections and the promotion of national collections. But as Bishop points out, in this increasingly global context, what does it mean to practice with this very fixed notion of nation or national property when we live with so many different voices, multiculturalism, universal resources? The third and final, and then we'll conclude, is that of the MSUM in Ljubljana, which opened in 2011. Now, this museum is somewhat different because it had no collection of it to call its own. So its role as a custodian is very, very different from that of the René Sevilla and von Abbe's museum, who are trying to establish new critical relationships to their collection. This new museum had no collection to call its own, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it had any less responsibility. Now, governments love collections. They love to support the representation of the ancient and mythic core of the nation. But because MSUM has no collection, it receives very little money. In fact, it's pretty broke. It therefore funds itself through book sales, education, events, and microfunding activities. It is a museum, but it also houses radical thought. You're more likely to see a radical keynote lecture from a politician concerned with social activism and democracy than you are to see the great works of, say, a Jeff Koons or a Jackson Pollock. So ironically, and this is me speaking, not Claire Bishop, it could be said that in many respects one of the ways to stamp out radicality is to fund it. And this is something that most politicians haven't got their head around, I don't think. Governments don't tend to follow the twisted logic is the best way to stamp out radicality is to fund contemporary art, but maybe they should. Just some conclusions and then we'll move on. Bishop argues that the rage for building the contemporary tends to fall into historical traps set by the collection, and in particular the role of the museum as custodian. The contemporary is not a set of recent objects carefully arranged around historical precursors, nor can it be reduced down to chronology or theme. So this logic that Tate Modern follows, which is that yes, we're trans-historical, yes, we're global, but there are still known great works within that in which we'll order our works around, just doesn't hold up to this question of the contemporary. The contemporary is, for Bishop, is a sense in which the museum establishes connections not just with objects, but with the instruments of history. In the last few years, we've seen considerable amounts of money ranging from small-scale projects and extensions to multi-million dollar extensions to the Art Gallery New South Wales in Sydney, but also of the National Gallery of Victoria. There is a rage for the contemporary, but the question Bishop leaves us with is, how contemporary are contemporary museums of art?